I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. Global economic tensions emanating from the pandemic have been further escalated by the arrests of high-profile Australians in China and Myanmar. My guest this morning is Tim Harcourt, Professor of Practice in Economics at the University of New South Wales. Tim, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Good to be back with you, Sean.
Tim, let's first go to Myanmar. Your friend and fellow economist Sean Turnell is being held by the military there. Why?
Well, interestingly, he's sort of the John Maynard Keynes of Burmese economics. So he's been advising, Aung San Suu Kyi for some time. And unfortunately, the coup came and he was on one of his visits because he doesn't live there. He's a fly-in, fly-out economist, a bit like me, a bit of an airport economist. But he just does Myanmar. And he just happened to be there, wrong place at the wrong time when the coup happened.
Wow. Have you spoken to him in recent times at all?
I spoke to him after the coup and I sort of said to him, look, you got to get out of there. You got to get out of there, mate. Like it's, things could get nasty. And in fact, one of his British colleagues, Michael Marriott Crosby, who is also an advisor, the British embassy got him out. The Aussie embassy was trying to get Sean out, but the military got there first. And, he's such as you know, knowing Sean too, he's such a selfless person. He's very committed to the people of Myanmar, but unfortunately that meant he's been detained.
Yeah, he's very passionate about, believing in democracy for that country. And I think he worked on the shadow banking system for Myanmar for a long while.
Yeah, you're right. He knows everything from finance to banking to agricultural reform to infrastructure, to tax. He's a good all-rounder, so no doubt he's indispensable there.
Yeah, he's also, as an aside, perhaps the person with the best general knowledge. He's an expert on Enid Blyton, believe it or not.
Yes.
So he has this incredible general knowledge, Sean Turnell.
Yes, and Hamilton. Hamilton's his big hero, the Treasury Secretary in the USA. So he's got that's his hero. So he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of Hamilton. So if you ever go to the musical with him, he'll know everything.
Well, let's hope we see him soon.
Hope so.
More broadly, what's Australia's economic interest in Myanmar? What's our relationship with them like, and do we do much trade?
I did an airport economist show there with Sean, actually, when Sean was there, and they have, we have ANZ and Cardo and a few resource players there, and really, Myanmar, they got their act together. They could be like a Vietnam or Thailand. They've got the natural resources, they've got the agriculture. They just need banking reform, they need regulatory reform, and they need a real injection in human capital. The education rates are still low. My crew and me, we had about 20 people to do the show, while we'd have, 2 or 3 here in Australia. And interestingly, Sean, the population of Canberra is in the military. That's a lot of people to have in the military in a country of 62 million, whatever it is. So Australia could really be a good resource advisor, agriculture advisor, services type of company. And there's a very active Australian chamber in Myanmar with Jodie Whedon and Chris Hughes, some of the lawyers there. One of the people, Alison, runs a Three Good Spoons, which is a NGO to help women learn skills so they can be domestic servants like Filipinas or Thais or so on. So there's a lot going on by the Australian community there, of course, including Sean, and a lot of Burmese here very interested in developing the country.
Yeah. Just moving on to China, there's also been an arrest of an Australian journalist in Beijing, I think.
Yes, well, that's right. Of course, the BBC's been banned in China now, so there's been a real crackdown on Western media that's been gradually happening during the pandemic, but even before the pandemic. So there's a bit of soft diplomacy conflict, I'd say, between a lot of nations, including Australia and China, which is a bit of a worry. Sort of happened under Xi Jinping, quite the opposite of previous leaders who wanted to open China up as much as possible.
Is it just Australia and China, or is China doing it broadly with other nations around the world?
China's had fights with the Czech Republic, with France, with Brazil, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, the EU, the USA. It's not just us.
We're not special.
We of course concentrate on us because that's where we are.
Yeah, but why do you think relations between Canberra and Beijing are so low at the moment, though?
Look, I think it's partly not just Australia. I think it's partly the Americans went from let's cooperate with China let's contain China to let's compete with China. You know, in the last years of the Obama administration, that got really turbocharged by Trump. And some people in Australia just said, well, the world's all about geopolitics and cybersecurity and spying and foreign policy and defence. And, you know, where goes America, we follow. And it doesn't take into account the very strong commercial relationship we have with China. So it's almost like you've got, you know, the spooks and the defence people saying, you know, with no thought to the economic consequences, you know, let's be really careful with China and let's diversify to India or Indonesia or whatever economically. And then you have a group in the business community who, of course, say, well, let's do whatever China wants us to do. So there's sort of a polarisation between, you know, people very anti-China to people very pro-China, when in actual fact, you know, we've got to sort of manage our relationship with China, knowing that we have very different systems, but we have, you know, economic complementarity.
We'll be back with more in a moment. My guest today is Tim Harcourt, Professor of Practice and Economics at the University of New South Wales and host of The Airport Economist. Do you think that we can find our way through the trade challenges at the moment? Obviously, iron ore hasn't been hit, but there are more than 50 coal ships with Australian coal sitting off the ports of China. Beef, barley, wine, other agricultural products have all been hit. Do you think we can somehow turn it round?
I think we can. I think in some ways this has hurt China more than us. I mean, they've denied Chinese consumers our products. They've denied Chinese industry valuable inputs. As you say, you know, they've had stoppages in their energy system. Price of iron ore is going up as a result. So they've made an economic hole for themselves. So eventually they'll want to dig it out. And we shouldn't just wait for China. I think we've got to make a diplomatic way out of it. And we can. You know, we've had a bumpy ride with China since, you know, Gough recognised it in 1973. So we can get out of it. But I've just been writing a book about Australia and Asia relations, and I had a look at Gough and China, and they always said he wasn't a Sinophobe, he wasn't a Sinophile, he just thought you should realistically engage with China. And I think all prime ministers, all Australian governments have had to do that without necessarily agreeing with a lot of what China does.
Joey, can we just talk about Japan a little bit? In the last couple of days, its share market's hit a new high, and its growth last quarter, December quarter, was at 3%. It's still the third largest economy in the world. It still takes a hell of a lot of our commodities, particularly coal. What do you think about that economy and what that can do for the region?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've written also about Japan in the same book, you know, because of course Blackjack signed that agreement with Japan in 1957, just 12 years after World War II.
Hold on. We're not all that old. Blackjack McEwen, is that right?
John McEwen, he was Trade Minister, Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, acting Prime Minister for a while Harold Holt was disappeared in the surf. And more importantly, he was the one with Jack Crawford at the ANU that really wanted to recognise Japan as a future trading partner for Australia, forged the agreement, and Japan basically allowed Australia to get into the Asian century and build all this wealth we've got. So we owe the Japanese a great deal. But of course, with the rise of China and India and ASEAN, you know, we've neglected Japan because it's just been such a good relationship for so long. And indeed, you know, they've got some signs that they're picking up, and perhaps we need a bit of a re-engagement with Japan like the good old days.
Now, all of these add to global trade and economic growth, and particularly for Australia, a lot of it does depend a hell of a lot on what happens with the rollout of the vaccines here and in Europe and in North America. What's your take on the tensions going on, particularly the EU delaying delivery of vaccines to different parts of the world, including Australia?
The fascinating thing for me, Sean, about COVID and coronanomics is that, you know, we thought the European Union was the big deal that was going to be the super state to lead the world. But during the pandemic, I mean, they were denying ventilators to Italy. They were being stockpiled in France. They were in fights with us with the vaccine. Really, people looked towards their own states, you know, their own governments for support, state and federal, in the pandemic. They didn't look to Brussels. And Brussels, if anything, has been an impediment to international trade. You know, they want to put export controls on. So, you know, a lot of us, I think, thought the Brits were mad voting for Brexit, but we haven't seen the best behaviour by the EU during this pandemic, particularly with the vaccine.
How do you think the rollout will go over the next few months?
Well, I think if I was your listeners, I'd buy some shares with Pfizer. They seem to be figuring out quite well.
Yep.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I guess the government bet big on University of Queensland and some of our very good technology and, you know, medical technology, and didn't come to fruition, and now they've had to play a bit of catch up. But luckily for them, all the controversy with the state premiers locking down, particularly in Victoria, has probably taken a lot of attention away from the vaccine rollout not being quite as good as Australia's handling of COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting. So while it is being rolled out over the next 3, 6, 12 months, what do you reckon about fiscal policy? JobKeeper ends at the end of next month. Do you think the government should extend it? JobSeeker, do you think the government should increase the base rate at the end of next month? Do we need more stimulus measures for aviation, etc.? What do you reckon?
Look, I think the issue's always been that when people were stuck at home, they couldn't spend much except on Dan Murphy's. So I always thought holding
and Bunnings, Tim, and Bunnings.
Yeah, speak for yourself, I suppose. Yeah. Someone said, I think it was Parnell McGuinness said, what I've learned about COVID is we spend a lot of time at Dan Murphy's. And I said, well, that's not true. They home deliver, you know.
Exactly.
But it's interesting. So a lot of people were stuck at home. So it wasn't a stimulus like the global financial crisis, you know, the go hard, go early, go households. So I would probably, you know, delay some of the fiscal stimulus. And I don't know whether you dump JobKeeper off a cliff, because it's interesting, as you say, aviation and tourism are still struggling. Higher education, which didn't even get JobKeeper, they thought the students were going to be back this year. And, you know, on my campus, pretty empty still. Yeah, I would have thought another look at JobKeeper. And we've sort of killed off that deficit and debt sort of fetish we used to have under the Abbott government. So, you know, I think there is some room economically and politically to extend JobKeeper and perhaps reform it to sectors that are still being hard hit, while some, of course, are roaring back quite well.
Tim, we'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Tim Harcourt, Professor of Practice and Economics at the University of New South Wales and host of The Airport Economist. You mentioned your campus, the University of New South Wales, which is one of the country's largest exporters of education.
I find it interesting, Sean. I've always thought that when COVID hit, the universities really should have gone to the government and said, look, we're part of your solution. You know, we've got to rethink, reskill and rebuild Australia. There's a lot of Australians in regional Australia, in the outer suburbs that would like to go to uni. We've still got all the infrastructure on campus. You know, we've still got the academics. You know, there's a lot of resources right here.
Yep.
And, you know, given that you can provide online relief in the short term for the international students, you could still have a look too at domestic students who, believe it or not, you know, Aussies want to go to uni as well. And, you know, while you've got all that capital in place and the academic stuff, you really could make yourself part of the solution, you know, to reskill the future of Australia after the pandemic.
Well, let's hope so. I mean, you'd like to think the higher education has a major role to play in the next couple of years in helping reflate Australia's place in the region. It's not just about commodities, but it is about the service sector and education and things like that.
I think that's right. And, you know, you think of the important role that international students have played in the region. You know, when I go to Singapore, 90% of my honours economics class at Adelaide Uni were from Singapore, and they're now head of the public service. You know, the president is an Adelaide graduate, and similar with other universities. You know, the gains you get down the track of having international students here when they go back to their own countries is enormous to trade and investment and future relationships. So, yeah, I agree, important role to play, and I think a lot of them really enjoy mixing with Australian and other students from other countries too when they have their experience here.
Yeah. Tim, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean.
That was Tim Harcourt, Professor of Practice and Economics at the University of New South Wales.